Chapter 4 of Penrod. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For information or to volunteer, visit www.librivox.org. Read by Jonathan Burchard, March 2009. Penrod by Booth Tarkington. Chapter 4 Desperation. The child, Sir Lancelot, found himself in a large anteroom behind the stage. A room crowded with excited children, all about equally medieval and artistic. Penrod was less conspicuous than he thought himself, but he was so preoccupied with his own shame, steeling his nerves to meet the first inevitable taunting reference to his sister's stockings, that he failed to perceive there were others present in much of his own unmanned condition. Retiring to a corner, immediately upon his entrance, he managed to unfasten the mantle at his shoulders and, drawing it around him, pinned it again at his throat so that it concealed the rest of his costume. This permitted a temporary relief, but increased his horror of the moment when, in pursuance of the action of the pageant, the sheltering garment must be cast aside. Some of the other child knights were also keeping their mantles close about them. A few of the envied opulent swung brilliant fabrics from their shoulders, airily, showing off hired splendors from a professional costumer's stock, while one or two were insulting examples of parental indulgence. Particular, little Maurice Levy, the child Sir Galahad. This shrinking person went clamorously about, making it known everywhere that the best tailor in town had been dazzled by a great sum into constructing his costume. It consisted of blue velvet knickerbockers, a white satin waistcoat, and a beautifully cut little swallow-tailed coat with pearl buttons. The medieval and artistic triumph was completed by a mantle of yellow velvet and little white boots sporting gold tassels. All this radiance paused in a brilliant career and addressed the child Sir Lancelot, gathering an immediately formed semicircular audience of little girls. Woman was ever the trailer of magnificence. "What you got on?" inquired Mr. Levy, after dispensing information. "What you got on under that old golf cape?" Penrod looked upon him coldly. At other times his questioner would have approached him with deference, even with apprehension, but today the child Sir Galahad was somewhat intoxicated with the power of his own beauty. "What you got on?" he repeated. "Oh, nothin'," said Penrod, with an indifference assumed at great cost to his nervous system. The elate Morris was inspired to set up as a wit. "Then you're naked!" he shouted exultantly. "Penrod Schofield says he hasn't got nothin' on under that old golf cape. He's naked! He's naked!" The indelicate little girls giggled delightedly, and a javelin pierced the inwards of Penrod when he saw that the child Elaine, amber-curled and beautiful Marjorie Jones, lifted golden laughter to the horrid jest. Other boys and girls came flocking to the uproar. "He's naked! He's naked!" shrieked the child Sir Galahad. "Penrod Schofield's naked! He's naked!" "Hush, hush!" said Mrs. Laura Rubush, pushing her way into the group. "Remember, we are all little knights and ladies today. Little knights and ladies of the Table Round would not make so much noise. Now, children, we must begin to take our places on the stage. Is everybody here?" Penrod made his escape under cover of this diversion. He slid behind Mrs. Laura Rubush, and, being near a door, opened it unnoticed and went out quickly, closing it behind him. He found himself in a narrow and vacant hallway which led to a door marked "Janitor's Room." Burning with outrage, heart-sick at the sweet, cold-blooded laughter of Marjorie Jones, Penrod rested his elbows upon a window-sill and speculated upon the effects of a leap from the second story. One of the reasons he gave it up was his desire to live on Maurice Levy's account. Already he was forming educational plans for the child Sir Galahad. A stout man in blue coveralls passed through the hallway, muttering to himself petulantly. "I reckon they'll find that hall hot enough now," he said, conveying to Penrod an impression that some too feminine women had sent him on an unreasonable errand to the furnace. He went into the janitor's room and emerging a moment later, minus the overalls, passed Penrod again with a bass rumble. "Darn 'em," it seemed he said, and made a gloomy exit by the door at the upper end of the hallway. The conglomerate and delicate rustle of a large, mannerly audience was heard as the janitor opened and closed the door, and stage fright seized the boy. The orchestra began an overture, and at that moment Penrod, trembling violently, tiptoed down the hall into the janitor's room. It was a cul-de-sac. There was no outlet save by the way he had come. Despairingly, he doffed his mantle and looked down upon himself for a last sickening assurance that the stockings were as obviously and disgracefully Margaret's as they had seemed in the mirror at home. For a moment he was encouraged. Perhaps he was no worse than some of the other boys. Then he noticed that a safety pin had opened, one of those connecting the stockings with his trunks. He sat down to fasten it, and his eye fell for the first time with particular attention upon the trunks. Until this instant he had been preoccupied with the stockings. Slowly, recognition dawned in his eyes. The Schofields' house stood on a corner at the intersection of two main-travelled streets. The fence was low, and the publicity obtained by the washable portion of the family apparel on Mondays had often been painful to Penrod, for boys have a particular sensitiveness in these matters. A plain, matter-of-fact washerwoman, employed by Mrs. Schofield, never left anything to the imagination of the passers-by, and of all her calm display the scarlet flaunting of his father's winter wear had most abashed Penrod. One day Marjorie Jones, all gold and starch, had passed when the dreadful things were on the line. Penrod had hidden himself shuddering. The whole town, he was convinced, knew these garments intimately and derisively. And now, as he sat in the janitor's chair, the horrible and paralyzing recognition came. He had not an instant's doubt that every fellow actor, as well as every soul in the audience, would recognize what his mother and sister had put upon him. For as the awful truth became plain to himself, it seemed blazoned to the world, and far, far louder than the stockings, the trunks did fairly bellow the grisly secret. Whose they were, and what they were. Most people have suffered in a dream the experience of finding themselves very inadequately clad in the midst of a crowd of well-dressed people, and such dreamers' sensations are comparable to Penrod's, though faintly, because Penrod was awake and in much too full possession of the most active capacities for anguish. A human male, whose dress has been damaged or reveals some vital lack, suffers from a hideous and shameful loneliness which makes every second absolutely unbearable until he is again as others of his sex and species, and there is no act or sin whatever too desperate for him in his struggle to attain that condition. Also, there is absolutely no embarrassment possible to a woman which is comparable to that of a man under corresponding circumstances, and in this a boy is a man. Gazing upon the ghastly trunks, the stricken Penrod felt that he was a degree worse than nude, and a great horror of himself filled his soul. "Penrod Schofield!" The door into the hallway opened, and a voice demanded him. He could not be seen from the hallway, but the hue and cry was up, and he knew he must be taken. It was only a question of seconds. He huddled in his chair. "Penrod Schofield!" cried Mrs. Laura Rubush angrily. The distracted boy rose, and as he did so, a long pin sank deep into his back. He extracted it frenziedly, which brought to his ears a protracted and sonorous ripping, too easily located by a final gesture of horror. "Penrod Schofield!" Mrs. Laura Rubush had come out into the hallway. And now, in this extremity, when all seemed lost, indeed, particularly including honor, the dilating eye of the outlaw fell upon the blue overalls which the janitor had left hanging on a peg. Inspiration and action were almost simultaneous. End of Chapter 5 of Penrod by Booth Tarkington. Read by Jonathan Burchard. March 2009.